Good afternoon, folks. If the system's working, we're online now for the first Resene webinar. I'm Rob Mountford, Resene's Northern Regional Technical Sales Support Manager. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Just looking at attendees as they're climbing up. We're well over 150 now online at present, and I can see the numbers clicking up as we go. So it's a fantastic turnout for our first webinar. Before I get into today's webinar, I thought I'd give a brief rundown of what the ongoing series will look like. Over time, we'll be covering off topics for architectural and specifiers. So we'll be doing that regularly, of course. Been covering interior designers, colour, fashions and trends, structural steel. We'll get into the AS NZS 2312 standards. We'll cover off fire group ratings and intumescent coatings at some point. We may even get in and do a section on frequently asked questions, just the things that trip you up every day. And we'll have guest speakers on all sorts of interesting topics, of course, as well over the coming years. CPD points will be available for most webinars, and of course, the topics will evolve over time, and our webinar look will evolve as well. Webinars will always be available following the broadcast on our webinar page on our website. So we'll be you'll find a library there, and as we build up the webinars, there'll be a good back catalogue of webinars for you to view. The first webinar today, the format's a fairly standard one at this stage. You're muted, which is quite good for a number of you, but you can type in questions, of course, and we'll attempt to answer them if we get time. However, the system does record your questions and will come back to you directly if your question isn't answered today. For today's first webinar, we're of course joined by Resene's Technical Director, Colin Gooch, who many of you will know well. Now, if the system works correctly, I'm just going to click on our webcam and show you that we are here live together in Wellington, and there we go. So we'll give you a wave.
Hey guys.
That's Colin on the left, of course, and we're gone now, so we're back into it. So we'll just roll straight into it today, I think. And as I say, if you've got questions, we'll attempt to answer them as we go. And it should be quite varied and interesting today. So I will, just bear with me a moment. Righto, we'll get the system working. So we'll cover off a quick bio of Colin, actually, just before we crack into it. Now, Colin started his career in the UK with ICI and then immigrated out to New Zealand in 1963. So I guess, Colin, you started there as something in technical, but I see that you moved into a technical services rep role in 1967. Was there a reason you moved out of technical?
Oh, absolutely. A very major reason. The salespeople all had cars, and I didn't. So that was the deep vocational move. There's a hold on too.
Excellent. Yeah. That's a good. Yeah, I think we've all done that. So in 1970, you came to Resene, which was originally called Stipplecoat, and you came across as chief chemist. And then in 1973, you became our technical director. So it looks fairly sparse there, and not much happening on your CV.
Well, indeed, I have got stuck in a bit of a rut with this. I should point out, chief chemist sounds pretty grand. It was the only chemist there, because we were pretty small at that stage, probably less than 1% of the market. So it was not a dog's body job, but it was a all-rounders job.
Excellent.
Sense, yeah.
Right, we'll get into the topics for today. So we're going to cover off, hopefully get through all of these. We'll cover off waterborne paint coatings, which is a vast area for Colin to cover. Get into some sustainable raw material info, and then into LRV versus TSR, which is something that comes up regularly for us. So we'll try and explain that as well. So I guess starting with Colin, that the world in paint coatings has changed dramatically over the last many years, 5, 10, 15 years, with most decorative paints now being waterborne and low VOC. So I'm always interested in the definitions of what actually waterborne or water-based actually means.
Yes, and it's really a highlight of paint. Notoriously, the nomenclature has been terrible. I'll just take you back through a little bit of history and where we've come to, because the question was initially that the challenges, particularly of low VOC paints. Before we get into that, there's just a couple of basic things, basic concepts we need to get a hold of, just to make sense of what's going to come through. And the first one I want to talk about a little bit is solubility. We talk about things being soluble, but sometimes you don't really understand what that means. True solubility is where one material, normally called a solute, when blended with a solvent, the solvent will be able to enter in between the molecules of the solvent, separate them, make them thinner, of course, but end up with a homogeneous solution on a molecular scale. So the molecules of the solvent lie absolutely next to the molecules of the solute. And the solvent chosen is very much depending on the solute itself. This is this concept of things which are hydrophilic, which love water, and things which are hydrophobic, which don't love water, and in fact love solvents such as terps and xylol and whatever. And the golden rule is, simple rule of thumb is, like dissolves like. So if you take something like sugar, for example, sugar is a carbohydrate. And from the name of it, it's carbon and hydrogen oxide and hydrate in the ratio of water. And so it's quite a water-loving material. So if I take sugar and I add water and stir it, they will dissolve completely. If I then cast some of that sugar on a plate and allow the water to dry off, the remaining sugar hasn't changed. I can put water on it and it'll redissolve, and it'll go on and on forever to do that. Similarly, if I took something like chlorinated rubber, it was always sensitive to the solvent, and chemically there's no change with it. So this a paint which is just purely dry by evaporation of solvent always remains sensitive. And they need to change chemically if that situation is going to change. For example, if I took my sugar and water solution and I put it on a pan and then on a top of the stove and then forgot it, what would happen was the water would evaporate and then the sugar would start chemically reacting. It would caramelize, would turn brown, it would spit as it spat out bits of water, and the chemistry would actually change. And what would happen is, as the chemistry changed, the molecular weight would grow and it would become less and less and less water soluble, until if you left it on the stove for half an hour, its solubility is completely changed.
Yeah.
And I throw that in because to make something which is water soluble, not water soluble, chemical change has got to occur. I did mention molecular weight with that sugar, and that's a really important concept too, just to understand the importance of molecular weight in paints. You probably hear me talk often about polymers. Polymers are pretty large molecules which are used as the binder for paint. And the higher the molecular weight, the bigger the molecular weight, the more durable paint will be. The reason for that is the aggressors to paint durability, UV light and water, what they're doing, they break down molecules. And so the bigger the molecule we start off with, the longer it's going to take down. So those are the two concepts on solubility, which is going to be important, and molecular weight. Higher, bigger, the better. Okay, having got those out the way, now let's start talking about waterborne paints and this woolly nomenclature that we always had. So, waterborne paints, water paints have been around forever, and paint's history really starts a lot in the fine art area, and in the fine art area, water-based paints such as tempera, gesso, distempers. These are typically have been around, and they rely on water-soluble materials, which will somehow change chemically to become water-resistant. And that change might be lime, picking up carbon dioxide and becoming insoluble, or egg tempera, for example. The proteins in eggs, they would build just as when you cook an egg, it goes from a liquid to a solid. Similar sorts of things could happen in the paint. So there's quite a lot of waterborne paint, but they were generally called by the specific, often Italian name, rather than being called as waterborne. And of course, the other thing the artist had was his oil paint. It was pretty much all that they had. And oil paint, predominantly linseed oil, was their base medium. Linseed oil is a low molecular weight material, it's a liquid, but when it's on a surface, it chemically changes, it reacts via oxygen in the air and turns from a low molecular weight material to a high molecular weight material. There's a lot of drawbacks with that material, and the industries, both the artist and later for house paints, they started modifying oils with hard resins, things like rosin or kauri, which was a famous thing in the past. And they then referred to these as being oil-based. Mm-hmm. So they weren't just oil, but they had a substantial amount of oil in them. And so that's what the name is set on them. And then other materials came along, such as epoxies and urethanes, and they couldn't quite put a name on that, so they called them solvent-based. And materials which needed special solvents, they started calling them spirit-based. And when water came along, they called them water-based. But of course, nothing is actually water-based, apart from ice. Yeah, I mean, water is simply there. It's simply there as a carrier for materials. Ducking back, we talked about high molecular weight, how important it is. High molecular weight materials are very thick, often solids, and need solvents added to them purely so they can transfer across to the surface. And water is there also purely for the transfer of the material from the can onto the wall. Once it's on the wall, it's not required at all. And there are many what are called water-based material.
I'm just going to ask a question there, actually. So when you say it's not required, so we're putting paint on the wall. That's a common thing that we're doing at different times of the year. When the moisture, it's obviously just evaporating out into the atmosphere. So
absolutely, and you're quite right. And in fact, I'll come back to that later, because it's one of the critical areas that we have. But a lot of paint technology is used for the transitory state in the can. Stuff that we have to use to make it stable in the can and get it onto the wall, we actually don't want in the paint film, and that is an issue with this too. There are materials called surface active agents. They come in a lot of other names. Detergents is one that's very familiar. All of these surface active agents are called amphiphilic molecules. Basically, they've got an A and a B structure. On the one molecule, they've got something which is very hydrophilic, which dissolves in water. The other end's hydrophobic, which dissolves in oils and other such materials. And these materials can be used to blend and mix non-water soluble materials in water. They actually wrap themselves around the oil particle and float it off in water as a droplet. I would say every person who's listening to us, if you're still listening to us, will have seen this phenomena every time that they do the dishes. If you try to wash dishes, particularly in cool water, and there's fat on there, you've got no chance whatsoever. Add hot water, it makes it a bit more mobile, but it still doesn't really get it off. Add a detergent, which is a surfactant material, and that will encapsulate the fat and it'll float it off into the washing water, and the dish will come out clean. This technique is used on a whole lot of things, not just fat off dishes, and that's how we can make waterborne alkyds, waterborne epoxies, waterborne urethanes. You imagine these are all little droplets, just like the fat in our washing up, surrounded by a suitable surfactant so it can float around in water. When the water comes out, these droplets can then fuse together and form a film. At this point, you can actually see, and the question should be, so what happens to the surfactant then? And the answer is, it typically remains in there as a bloody nuisance.
Yes.
It serves no further purpose. It helps to keep it makes the film water sensitive. Sometimes it comes out if a dew or condensation is on it, it will actually bring it to the surface, often redeposit it.
And that's a common problem that we deal with in the field is surfactant leaching, and that's, if those that are listening understand that in bathrooms particularly, that's why we've developed new waterborne technology for our enamel coatings in bathrooms, our room velvet, is if the surface is hit too soon after applying the paint, that surfactant's sitting on the surface and you get the watermarks, and which in the early phase are easily wiped off, but the longer you leave them there.
Absolutely. So because the surfactant's in there, it can either disappear into the polymer or just sit in the water phase and sit up on the surface. And yes, as you so rightly say, particularly if it's rained on, it's not so bad. It can get washed out, and you can find that the film actually toughens up quite a bit after rain. Roof paints, you'll see the instruction. If you're using drinking water off this roof paint, disconnect the tank so that those surfactants can wash out, and that actually toughens it up.
And we often see them in they're more noticeable in darker colors than they are in lighter colors.
Yes, that's true, and they're also more noticeable in low sheen than in dead flat.
Yeah.
So, so that's how we get those waterborne ones. But that's not really the main thrust of these. All of these that I've mentioned, the alkalis, the epoxies, the urethanes, these are low molecular weight materials which build up on the surface. The typical acrylics that we use are very different, and I've got to duck back to, I'm going to make an example of a thing called vinyl paints. Those who have got white hair would remember that way back, polyvinyl chloride was an extremely useful polymer for protective coatings paints. It was tremendous water resistance and corrosion resistance. That used at the inside of pen stocks, all sorts of things. They wanted it at a high molecular weight, and it was not unusual to have paints which had 80 to 85% solvent in them and used multiple coats. This was obviously a huge drawback to these paints, and the way that they became overcame, and this is particularly what's used for acrylics now, is that they learned to build the polymer actually inside an emulsion droplet. So they formed an emulsion of this material and then polymerized that to massive molecular weights, up to 1 million, and it's still just floating around in this little droplet. And that's the concept really that we have with acrylics. The acrylics, as we get them, are tiny little droplets. One could call them nanoparticles. They're normally about 100 to 200 nanometers. And they form the film by the water coming off and these particles fusing together. The particles themselves, the hardness of them, can be determined by the ratio, the blend of acrylics that we use, and they can go from very soft to very hard. The hardest acrylic is polymethyl methacrylate, which is perspex, which is very hard and exceptionally durable. Some of the soft acrylics form pressure-sensitive adhesives. We sort of juggle in between these areas to make paint. One of the critical things, of course, is that these polymers, with these particles, when they come together, as the paint is drying, they must be soft enough to adhere one with the other and stick and fuse, because that's the way that the film is made. And clearly, the softer the particle, the easier that task is. And the vice versa, the harder the particle, the more difficult it is. So soft films, so soft particles make soft films, and soft films, good integrity, but they're soft and they pick up dirt and they block. Yeah, it means they stick together. Yeah. And they're not very useful. And so the technique was to make the films, the particles, hard, and then soften them temporarily by adding a solvent. So you stir a solvent into this dispersion of hard particles, the solvent will diffuse into them and solubilize in the acrylic and hence soften them. So when the particles came together, they would stick nicely together. And then the solvent would evaporate out of the film and revert to its hard particle. The solvents we use are called VOCs.
Right. The magic.
So
VOC.
Yes, and so that whole technique of using hard particles and transitionally softening them with a thing we used to call them coalescing agents is more or less been taken away. Not completely, but more or less has been taken away. Solvents in the paint can help film formation, as I've just described, but they can also help to moderate the evaporation of water. We're in a water world, and I make a paint in Fiji, in Suva, it might be 30 degrees and 100% humidity, and it'll take an hour to dry. I can take the same paint across to the western side into Nandi, same temperature, lower humidity, and a bit of a breeze, and it'll dry in a minute.
Right.
With the problems that that have. Certain solvents, such as propylene glycol, which is a particularly useful material, quite a bland material that's used as a food additive, slows down the evaporation of water really quite nicely, and so we can control that, use it to control the evaporation. But that's also considered a VOC. And we just don't have it when it's just water. We've got no control whatsoever. We also could use solvents, and do, in making waterborne road marking paints, trying to get them to dry faster, because you can use alcohol in those and to pull these out. So that can help to pull the water out faster. So the presence of solvents is extremely useful. The lack of them always reduces film properties. There's been a tremendous amount of engineering done on these nanoparticles to help make materials which don't need solvents. One of the chief ploys is to make the particles a bit more like peanut toffee, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
These very hard segments like the peanuts, which give the hardness for the film, and this soft toffee-like material is a softer phase, which help the film stick together. We also use cross-linking. There's a whole range of techniques that we use to try and overcome this. But for all the elegance of the polymer manufacturers and all the clever stuff they do, every time the film will be improved if you add some solvent. It just acts as a flux and helps get these things together.
So now, and like we started with, are now changing, or it's not changing, it's changed. So it sounds like, listening to the complexities of developing and manufacturing paint to perform across a wide range of conditions, it must be a heck of a challenge.
It is, it's such an easy thing for a legislator to say, we'll reduce the VOC.
Yeah.
The cascade effect of that is great, but I'm not going to cry on anyone's shoulder. I mean, that's our job to do that. But some of the tremendous advances which have been made by the polymer chemists have almost been nullified because we can't use solvents with them. So the present materials that we have, I wouldn't say they're quite as good as the best solvent modified acrylics, but they're hanging in there, and they could be made so much better if we had an allowance to use more solvents in it. Yeah.
So in terms of, we've moved on to a slide there with durability. So with waterborne technology, how does the performance? We all know and have experienced solvent-based enamels, so if you like, and how is the performance of the new waterborne coatings? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it much the same? Is it?
Okay, let's just duck back. The days of acrylics when we could use VOC, as far as the durability of the binder, even though it did have some residual surfactants in there, far outperformed standard alkyd by the alkyd enamels by a long way. They typically certainly outperformed for durability epoxies and aromatic urethanes. And so they're, remember what it was, molecular weight here of 1 million, very hard materials, a lot of perspex-like materials in there, extremely durable. Where they sit now, I think they have they're still ahead of the standard alkyd by a long way, a long way. But they're probably just sitting a little behind the heyday of the VOC containing materials, because all of the tricks that we have to do generally add a slight weakness to them. Yeah.
Great. We'll move on. Obviously, we talked about formulating and manufacturing paint there, and it all comes from raw materials. So we often hear the term sustainable raw materials, or in our industry, and in general terms, we know that that's about avoiding the depletion of a resource. So we'll be interested to hear what are sustainable raw materials in paint, and where do they come from?
Okay, yeah, it's pretty big topics here, broad topics. At the first, I think we ought to get a picture of what is meant by sustainable. And I came across a definition which I quite like. I've got a slight reservation on one word there, but and this definition says, sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And I think that's a pretty good sort of definition. And what it has come to mean in a secondary role is, if we can keep growing materials on a regular basis, and we use those as the basis for paint raw materials, then these would certainly be considered sustainable. But again, don't think this is a modern thing, Rob. Way back, things were sustainable. In fact, we talked about the artist paints and oils. I mean, they're of course a sustainable material. And oils are still used quite a lot. In fact, vegetable oils will feature quite a bit throughout this. But soya oil, linseed oil, and a whole variety of different vegetable oils, some which can be used as direct binders, others which are used as a source of hydrocarbon to make other stuff. And interesting, the vegetable oils, of course, they use the alkyds these days. So any alkyd will have a sustainable element to it. And strangely enough, there's a large branch of epoxy curing agents, things called polyamides, which are oil-based and have been for 50, 60 years have been there. So they are there and have been. Another material, cellulose. We certainly use cellulose today. In the past, it was significantly greater, particularly in the area of when nitrocellulose and nitrocellulose lacquers were used. This was a large area of painting, and these were directly based on cellulose from plants, whether cotton or from trees. And these, of course, were completely renewable. Really, interesting history, because it started off actually as gunpowder, or as an element of gunpowder, and this was, they called it nitrocellulose. It was called gun cotton. And one of the big movers in explosive with DuPont company, that started off by a French emigre coming across to the States with a black powder recipe and setting it on the banks of the Brandywine River, making black powder. It was good material, and he did very well. In fact, it also tells why DuPont are one of the most safety conscious companies in the chemical industry, because of making this. So they make their factories out of stone, but the roof's out of tin. So if something did blow up, the roof would blow off and dissipate the material. Nitrocellulose is a polymer. Nature does a good job with cellulose. That's another very high molecular weight material. Difficult to work with, but when nitrated, it becomes soluble. And DuPont used nitrocellulose to make a lacquer. They dissolved it in some very strong oxygenated solvents, and they made a lacquer. Now this was incredibly timely because it was the time when Henry Ford was getting going, and he could put together a car in 2 or 3 days, but it used to take him about 11 days to coat it. It was a multi-coat system, it was oil-based, it was so slow, the recoat time. So when DuPont came along with their lacquer based on nitrocellulose, which is called Dulon, completely revolutionized the industry, and also made DuPont a hell of a lot of money. In fact, I think they ended up owning 50% of General Motors. Henry Ford wouldn't sell him any shares, but General Motors did. There's another really interesting area with nitrocellulose. Right about that time, and even earlier, you've probably got no idea how popular billiards used to be. It was absolutely endemic everywhere. I think in Chicago in the 1890s, I think there's something like 1,250 billiard halls. I think there's about 30 now. So I'll give you an idea of now what the hell am I talking about billiards for? In order to get a set of billiard balls, you needed one elephant's tusk. If there's a big elephant, you could get 5 balls out of it, but you kill a good healthy elephant to get, say, 8 billiard balls. And imagine the popularity of this game. Billiard balls, not only were they difficult, they were expensive. The elephant population was serious, and so there's a competition put out by who can derive and manufacture a synthetic billiard ball. And one of the first was to take nitrocellulose, which we know is pretty unstable material, but plasticizing it. I think camphor was the material particularly used, and the first synthetic billiard balls were actually based on that material that you see on the screen in front of you, nitrocellulose. It's quite interesting. It's a little unstable, and sometimes, depending on climatic conditions, when the billiard balls struck each other, you could get small explosions going on. Bang! There was one proprietor, I think it was a place in Kentucky, mentioned to the salesman, he said that he didn't mind the small explosions, but he said, but every one of his customers drew their gun, which was more concerning.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. I think you mentioned previously as well with the nitrocellulose lacquers that they were limited in a colour range early.
Well,
and Henry Ford had a famous saying, didn't he? And I forgot to push the forward button before, but I'll do it now if I can click on there. And of course, it was any colour you wanted.
Any colour as long as it's black. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. We used to, in fact, some paint companies have any colour as long as it's white.
Very good.
So cellulose ethers are still used in the paint industry today. Still in some lacquer work. Butyl ethers are used, and also we use some ethers for thickening agents. Other materials which are used are waxes. They're all pretty. Most of them are sustainable. Well, beeswax, carnauba wax, which is a very important one that comes from the leaf of a palm tree that grows in northeast Brazil. Candilla wax, you get coconut wax. So several of these waxes can be sustainable. There are waxes which come from fossil fuels, but there is an alternative in this area. And so where are we at with sustainability? Yeah, it's a really hot topic. There's a lot of research which is going on today to develop newer sustainable raw materials. I mean, and every year there's always some wacky ones. There's always some university in the corner of somewhere who's come up with they're going to make a new paint binder out of gnats' foreskins or some such material like that. But there's a lot of really serious work being done, and vegetable oils are a very important element as a source of chemical, and also as are polysaccharides. Polysaccharides sounds a big name. It's just another name for sugars. So polysaccharides include starch, cellulose, for example, and a lot of other sugars that are used in nature. And they use a lot of I've forgotten the name. The fermentation as a process of breaking down polysaccharides into smaller building units, and then using these as chemicals, as building blocks to build up materials. And there's a lot of these things happening right now. I mentioned earlier, if you remember, about these surfactants, where some of them have got the amphiphilic, the hydrophilic portion of it, that can come from fossil fuels, but more and more of them now are with sugars tacked on the end of them. That. Because sugars are also always a little more sensitive to bacterial degradation, but nonetheless, as long as we can use preservatives, which is also a hot topic, they can be used. We ourselves became involved in this area. In fact, we spent a seven-figure sum on trying to make novel paint binders out of cellulose, and once we got some useful data and patents out of that, there were some issues which I'll come back to very shortly. So, sources of cellulose, such as pine tree, and all the waste that comes from the pine tree, is a very valuable target for people who are looking at this area. And in other parts of the world, things like in the sugar industry, all the bagasse that comes off the cane, that's all got a lot of cellulose in it. There's also from the trees a lot of a material called lignin cellulose, timbers, cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And lignin, completely different chemistry, but also rich in possibilities. We were exploring some of these possibilities with the world expert on this. There was a phone call, and this lady was from America, and we went through a whole list of potential materials. And at the very end of the conversation, this lady said, "Colin, you can just about make any goddamn thing from lignin," he says, "apart from money." And so they were less excited about how it was to convert lignin into
right.
But I was talking about cellulose and our efforts in this area. And one of the reasons why, or the main reason why it didn't progress, is because the chemistry of making things from cellulose is clunky. You have to add a lot of reagents, excess of reagents, and stew it up and clean stuff out and refine it and then reprocess. There's a whole lot of stuff which is difficult to do and drives the price up. That's why the aim to use standard building blocks is so that we use the current pots and pans that all the rental manufacturers have. And so ideally, if I can take butyl alcohol from a fermentation process or from a fossil fuel, it doesn't matter the pots are made. If it's butyl alcohol, you can stick it into any process that uses it. Acrylics technology are particularly elegant. There's a whole range of acrylic monomers. If you imagine these like these little pop-link necklaces, and this is what the acrylic technology does. Basically, it takes a vat full of these individual links of these pop-up necklaces, if you wish. You can blend with what the each individual link, whether you want some hard or soft or whatever you want. You transfer it into a reaction vessel, and these links just fit together. Bang, 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 bang. As simple as that. Very quickly, you can process it within 2 or 3 hours, and the conversion rate is absolutely, well, not quite 100%, but it's in the high 99s. So the elegance of the material, the process, is very difficult to beat, and that's why there's so much effort getting into trying to make acrylic monomers from natural resources. Acrylic monomers or acrylic esters are a 2-part molecule. It's made of acrylic acid and an alcohol, and you put these things together to form an ester, and then we put these in and make paint from it. The acrylic acid or methacrylic acid can be made synthetically from sustainable resources, but it's an extremely difficult process and is not commercial and doesn't look like being commercial for any significant time. The alcohol side, however, alcohols are made readily with a fermentation process, and these can be made sustainable and are. So right now, every acrylic that you make has probably got about an average of about 15% of sustainable monomer in it. We don't claim this because we never know when we buy the material whether it has been made with a sustainable alcohol or not, because all of these alcohols simply go into a big feed tank and get mixed up, and so it's on average. There is a company who are putting out a thing, well, you can claim we've got an average of 15%, but we don't really feel particularly comfortable with saying, yeah, this has got a sustainable element to it, when it actually may not in that particular can. However, there is some really good work being done on another acid rather than acrylic acid, which is available again through a fermentation process. And by the use of this acid and sustainable alcohols, we have now, and we are evaluating in our laboratories, acrylic binders or acrylic type binders with a sustainable content of 40%. Now we think that that's a pretty exciting target to be got at. This new acid has got a hell of a lot of difficulties associated with it, and you can't use it 100%. But to get up to 40, this is now we start to think, yeah, this is starting to get pretty exciting. And so, as the question is, yes, there's a lot of work going on in this area, and even reverting to some waterborne alkyds in our range against some of the acrylics is also a step in that direction too.
I guess that's that whole in that area that we know better nowadays, and some of that technology that we've used in the past now can be, we've got new ways of using it, new raw materials, and progress on with technology. Yeah,
it will. It's all going. I don't think we're going to see a brand new technology stream which says this is a totally new different binder, but I think you're going to see lots and lots of building blocks which we're going to plug into where we are.
Well, I've had someone fire in a question on vegan paint. Now, I'm not going to, I know you're passionate about that topic and have done a great architectural memo, so we'll treat that as another webinar at some stage. I'm only kidding.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Can't use beeswax in vegan paint.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know you're an expert on it.
Yeah.
So, now we're probably running a little bit behind here, but we'll try and whiz through. We're going to move on to light reflectance values now and total solar reflectance. So we'll try and whiz through this as quickly as we can. But
can do. Yep.
Yeah.
For sure.
And so this is an interesting one. We often in our side of the business, when dealing with trade painters, architects, specifiers, and particularly colour interior designers, and where colour choices are being made, and we've got manufacturers putting limitations on their substrate on colour choice and LRVs, and so I thought it's a really interesting one to cover today. The difference between, say, a light reflectance value and total solar reflectance. Now, this first slide I particularly like because this is one that shows that an LRV of 50% can be quite different colours.
Yeah, indeed, Rob, and it is an interesting subject, and I see the time that I've talked to very much, which is my
we wanted you to talk to.
And it's quite possible that we may get part of the way through this. We may readdress it, but you're absolutely right. Light reflectance value tells us absolutely nothing about what the colour is at all. And so if you're in the Waitaki District Council and you want subdued colours throughout there, just putting a light reflectance value on does absolutely nothing at all. And that's basically, when we're talking light, we're talking visible light reflectance, and all of these colours will reflect some and absorb some, and across the whole colour spectrum. And as I say, it's somewhat meaningless with regards to well, it tells you little. So if you could just flip up, So the world's got two sources of energy. So we've got the heat from the magma, which is down below our feet, which we do deplete a little bit with our hydrothermal energy stations, but the vast majority of it comes from the sun, and it comes across quite a wide spectrum. And you see the pie chart in front of you. Ultraviolet is in there at 5%, visible at 44%, and the infrared at 51%. When we're talking light reflectance values, we're only talking about in that visible range. And in the infrared, we've got this other large bunch of energy, and this is what we are addressing with the cool color technology. With the cool color technology, you've basically you've got to ignore the visible part of it. The ideal cool color chemistry is if we had a black paint, which is absolutely cool. Just leave that one on there. And a black paint absorbs all visible light energy. It absorbs it, and that light energy decays to heat, and so that's fixed. So our playground, if you like, is in the infrared. So in this area here, which shows the wide range of wavelengths of energy. So Yeah, the gamma rays and the X-rays we can forget about, because fortunately our atmosphere will absorb those. They interact both with oxygen to form ozone, and then with ozone to form oxygen again. And this is a cycle which goes on, and there is sufficient to absorb all of those rays. And these are really aggressive rays. In fact, the shorter the wavelength, the more aggressive these rays are. And those, the gamma and the X-rays, if we were exposed to those, we would fry for sure. But the oxygen ozone balance sorts that out for us. The UV, a very small pocket of light, but still the most aggressive, and that's why with sunblocks, it's the UV that you're trying to filter out, because that's the great damage. Visible spectrum, which we're very familiar with, going from violet up to red, and then after the red is the infrared. And we are basically looking at, so the visible light goes from just under 400 nanometers wavelength up to 750. Infrared is a big bunch of stuff which goes from about 750 to 2500. And so, and the visible light, of course, it's its name simply because of our eye. Our eye has evolved to see these bands, and that's what we that we work on. So, if you would just put the next slide, Rob, is sure. Okay. So this slide in front of you is the nub really of what we do there. The red block is showing you what the visible light wavelengths are, and we've got 3 lines on there. We have the blue line which runs across the top, and that is white. And no matter what we do with cool color paint, we can't get better than white. White is far superior to everything. It's what we are trying to do is make white whiter. Currently, the average is about 93% reflection. We are striving to see if we've got means of increasing that, and we've got to play with some particle size and do so. It's not a trivial task. But let's be absolutely clear, white is king. The orange line at the bottom is carbon black. And carbon black is the mother of all absorbers. It absorbs everything in the visible area and the UV. In the visible area, that's why we see black. We see no reflected colors whatsoever, and so it absorbs all visible light. The eye can't detect it, and it absorbs right away through the infrared range. The grey material is the heart of our cool color technology, which is a material which is substantially black. And I say substantially because if you follow the curve, you can see there is some reflection in the red area. So you don't get these complete jet blacks you can with carbon black. You do get some reflection there. I should also point out, by the way, that with the white, you do get a little bit of reflection in the yellow. You know, I said sometimes it's difficult to get a really cold white. But you can see in the area between 700 basically and 2500, that's where we sit. Mm-hmm. And the technology that we do there actually reflects, not uniformly as you can see, but it does reflect colors in that area. If I make a color which is basically on cool black, and I add a very small amount of carbon black, our B tinter, for example, you can nullify. Carbon black is such an absorbing material. You can nullify this this effect in it. So whatever we do, we ought to keep them absolutely clear of carbon black. Now I see the.
We'll keep going. We are aware we're right on the end or the time frame that we were talking to, but we'll keep going. Given that this is our first webinar, I'm not sure how that's going to affect our attendees and viewers, but we'll just finish off here and
Okay.
and then we'll come back to you. I have seen a few questions come in. Apologies that we haven't got to those today. As I say, it is our first webinar, so we're going to get better at being able to communicate and be more interactive with you. For those that have submitted their questions, we will come back to you directly anyway. But Colin will finish off now, and hopefully you're still viewing this, and we'll only be a few minutes, and we'll be done.
Indeed, we've broken the back of it. There. So this is the nub of the technology.
Yep.
What do we have in the next slide?
So we're just showing that example of
yes,
visual of,
and it is. It's dramatic. Although it's completely not intuitive, I don't like it. Anti-intuitive, unintuitive, I don't know. These two colors, the gray on the left is made with carbon black, and the one on the right is made with cool color technology, and they have exactly the same total solar reflectance. And I should have said, of course, total solar reflectance we measure from 400 up to 2,500 rather than measuring from 400 to 700. You can actually see, if you look closely, the temperatures. This is the percent rise, 16.3 rise on that, 15.8 rise on that. So it really is. It's technology that does work. And
I think it's important as well. Sometimes sometimes we all we expect the surface to be cool to touch. It's cool colors, but that's not actually the case.
No, because if we go back, if we looked at that other graph, we are reflecting about 55% of the infrared. So there's still some infrared coming in there.
Yeah.
It's how it compares with something of the same color. In fact, we've got some bar graphs of different colors. Yeah. So, yes, and this here, I mean, you can read those yourself.
Yeah.
But these are the solar reflectance and what's achieved. And basically, what we're looking at is we are reflecting a little over half of what falls between 700 and 2,500. So that's why these figures of these darker colors sit between 25 and 31. That's because that's the game that we play in. And so, but you see, it's quite substantial. If you look at iron sand, for example, it's a factor of 4 in there.
Just one last question, Colin, is that it's the way I understand it, it's extremely difficult, that there's no correlation between an LRV percentage, and it's not an easy thing to give a direct correlation to TSR, and it's a difficult calculation.
It really is, and it's got to be measured. In fact, I think we're probably the only people, certainly the only paint company in Australasia who has the equipment to measure this this thing. But it's a question of having to measure it from 700 through to 250. There's about, with light reflection, you can almost guess it. If you know the light reflection of one color, you can think, oh yeah, that's about that sort of area to be in. You can't do it with these.
Sure.
Yeah, and I just want to point out the fact that it's cool. Obviously, it affects the temperature and the comfort. But every chemical reaction basically doubles every 10 degrees you raise. And so degradation reactions, how a paint film degrades, is increased the harder it is. So we do improve the durability, and we've seen that, and also it improves the performance of heat-sensitive substrates.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's about us done today, Colin. We do have a few more slides in there. We're just showing examples of where Cool Color technology is used. I'm sure that many people out there have used it and understand where it goes. We would flick through to a Q&A, but we've fortunately, it's been a great session. Thank you.
If I got a chance just to say the audience out there, this is our first. We've got no idea, really, and trying to stop me rambling on is a little bit of a problem. But I'd certainly like feedback on whether you felt it was too flippant, whether it was whether you needed more grunt, whatever your impressions. I would be to improve. I don't want you to pee in my pocket. To improve the sessions, I'd appreciate it.
We'll communicate directly with all attendees, and we'll come out, and then anyone can email us at any time at webinar@resine.co.nz. And as I mentioned earlier, and as it's showing on the screen, the webinars will be available fairly shortly to review on our webinar page on our website. So thanks again, guys, for tuning in. We very much appreciate it. It's been an exciting time for us, and we will be coming back out to you in the new year. First webinar again in March 2020, and we will be regular with these now, and once a month to begin with, but we may actually ramp up the frequency. So thank you, Colin, for speaking with us today. It's been very interesting, and thank you out there for attending. Now, if I can log this off, I should do it correctly, and it should finish your webinar session.